Hey everybody, this is WobblyWallaby. Want to do better in Ragnarok Mobile PvE instances? Then make sure you hit the critical stats to optimize your damage. Regardless of whether you're free to play or pay to win, I'll go over the critical stats that have been compiled by the Ragnarok Mobile community in one convenient video. I'll also be doing damage tests to show you one of the critical stats that I think people most mess up. Does it make a big difference? Absolutely, and I've had times where my damage improved greatly because I switched some of my gears around. Now, before I discuss each instance, I do want to discuss how people get these critical stats. For example, in rumhandbook.com, there's a museum legend buff list, but seeing these numbers don't always make much sense for many people. So luckily, people in the community have made infographics that make it much more easier to understand. Let's begin with TTL. This infographic is created by Alex. The elemental reductions are quite insane. For the most part, it is at 90% with the exception of Ghost and Dark, but I personally don't think you should aim for 90% elemental damage increase just for TTL. That is quite high, and personally I would just focus on the 200% ignore defense as a priority. As mentioned in the disclaimer at the bottom, nullifying the reductions aren't always worth it. You do need to test it out yourself. Next is the 30% demi-human reductions. This gives a huge advantage to classes that can transform because you can bypass this. Some example classes that can transform are Rune Masters with the Death Awakens, Wrathgrassi with Valkyrie, and Ronin with Infernal Armor. There are other classes out there, but these are just examples. These bypass the demi-human damage reductions, which is quite unfair. They used to have this for other instances, but they have removed it later. I think this is more balanced. For the stats to nullify reductions, I agree that 200% ignore defense and 40% skill damage or 40% auto attack damage are good stats to aim for. The parts that say no reduction is due to the boss having 0% in reductions, so for example for physical and magic damage reductions for Tesseract, it is at 0%, so penetration and magic penetration, which is what offsets this, has no reductions. But you should definitely be investing in penetration and magic penetration to boost your damage. Next, for museum instances, elemental damage reductions is huge. Unlike TTL, I definitely feel this when I'm using various classes. One important note is that there's a 90% wind damage reduction that used to punish Novice Guardians who were extremely popular. The devs never did balance this after Novice Guardians stopped being popular. For this, I would recommend you never use wind in Legend Museum, you will regret this. The only exception is Thor, since his insane strength and wind coefficients overcome this. For elemental reductions, it is fine to go above 50% against some bosses. Often, players will use elemental accessories and armors to boost their damage like crazy against the bosses, but definitely do this after you've achieved 200% ignore defense and magic defense. Next, for critical stats, you must hit 200% ignore defense and magic defense, then getting a good balance of penetration, skill, or auto attack damage. Not every class can hit these critical stats of 50% skill damage, 80% penetration, or magic penetration, or 50% auto attack damage. I personally choose classes that can add skill or auto attack damage increases since these are the ones that are harder to get. You can only get so much from gachas, and then the other big ones come from very expensive cards. In my opinion, penetration and magic penetration is much easier to get. Next, for Isles, it is very similar to Museum. Again, elemental damage increases make a big difference, and again, when damage is heavily punished. Next, for key stats, again, 200% ignore defense and magic defense is critical, and the rest is a balance. Again, 50% skill damage, 50% auto attack damage, and 80% penetration and magic penetration are the recommendations. Next is PSR, thanks to Chuck for the infographics. This table shows both the boss's offensive and defensive stats. You need to look at the reductions. Flytut explains it quite well on how the offset is based on the reductions. A note about the defensive percentage and MDEF percentage is you need to add 100% to it, as bosses themselves have 100% defense and magic defense normally. For the PSR dragon, you need 170% ignore defense. For the other legend instances we covered so far, you need 200%, so with 30% less, you can definitely modify your gears, gachas, and cards to optimize your damage further. Surprisingly, the skill damage and magic damage reductions are at 10%, that means you should have at least 10%, and I definitely recommend you exceed that. I personally still try to get the highest balance of all these stats, and I still try to aim for the same one as the other legend instances, which is 80% penetration or magic penetration, and 50% skill damage or auto attack damage. Now you might be wondering why your damage seems so low against a PSR dragon, and the reasoning is the 99.87% ultimate reduction, which makes your damage look horrible compared to the other instances. Next, for White Star Airship 15, all the elemental reductions are at 20%, so it's safe to use all things including wind. For Ignore Defense, you do need 200% and the rest is about the same as PSR. Do try to get a balance of optimal stats to optimize your damage. The skilled damage, and magic damage reductions are at 20%, but you'll definitely want much higher than that. Next, for Ghost Palace, the data mining from Chromistia I've seen so far is from the beta server, where there are now 3 difficulties, which is Novice, Brave, and Legend. For now, to prevent spreading the incorrect warrior difficulty info on our servers, I'll just say that I've tested the Ghost Palace's Ignore Defense, and I can confirm that it is at 160%. Here's my test. When my Ignore Defense is at 157%, I hit for 151,000. Now I equip a Clean Donut Trap for 8% Ignore Defense. I'm at 165% Ignore Defense. Then I hit for 155,000. Next, when I equip a Nut on Head for an extra 5% Ignore Defense, I'm at 170% Ignore Defense. I hit for 155,000 with no change in the damage. So just a warning, don't go above the required Ignore Defense, it doesn't do anything. I talk about Ignore Defense and Ignore Magic Defense quite a lot, and I want to show just how important it is. For example, in this test, my Thanatos has 147% Ignore Defense. Like many other classes, you might see them using Dragon Bone Shield since the physical damage increase is insane. Also, this one has 5% penetration as well with the enchants in tier 5. Next, I hit the Legend Dragon for 1.31 million damage. Now I equip a Clean Vicious Wound. This will give me 50% Ignore Defense. My Ignore Defense is now at 197%, which is close to the ideal 200% Ignore Defense. I hit for 1.45 million damage, which is higher than the Dragon Bone Shield. This is to show you that Ignore Defense is extremely important. Just because you see videos where they recommend Dragon Bone Shield, it doesn't always mean it's ideal for you. The reason why people can use Dragon Bone Shield is due to the Ignore Defense enchants or the other class's skills. For example, my Ronin hits 200% Ignore Defense, and I can use Dragon Bone Shield only because I have Morale enchants. Altogether, this adds 55% Ignore Defense, which is huge, but for new players who may lack these Ignore Defense Morale enchants, please consider using the Ignore Defense offhand. Now, of all the critical stats, I do think Ignore Defense and Ignore Magic Defense is the easiest to screw up. If you have too little, your damage will suffer, and if you have too much, you're not being optimal and losing out on potential damage sources. So definitely keep this in mind as you're building your character. Now, if you need examples of these critical stats sources, you can check out my description for my link to my Kalitzberg and my Liu Maoxing video. That breaks down some of the key sources from my build. Here's a summary of the critical stats. In general, my strategy is first to get the ideal Ignore Defense and Ignore Magic Defense. Then I try to focus on skill damage and auto attack damage. I usually try to get about 40 to 50%. Then I want to boost my elemental damage as much as possible through accessories or through the elemental damaging armor. Then I would invest in penetration and magic penetration, usually trying to hit about 70 to 80%. The reason why I like using Kalitzberg so much is she's one of the easiest classes to attain all the critical stats without having to sacrifice much, and that gives me more flexibility to maximize my elemental damage. Well, that's all. Good luck balancing your critical stats and doing more damage. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Here's a video that I recommend, and if you want to learn how to get stronger in Ragnarok Mobile, check out this playlist over here.